Hi everyone, welcome back to Ukrainian Media Podcast. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and today I'm excited to be joined by Professor Andriy Portnov, a famous Ukrainian historian who based in Germany. Hello, Andriy.
Hello, nice to see you.
Let's proceed to the topics. To kick off things, I'd like to talk a little bit about global politics, particularly German-Ukrainian relations. You mentioned the notion of historic and anti-Americanism in Germany. Could you explain this idea in more detail? How can this anti-Americanism help Ukraine now?
Okay, so how it could help Ukraine, I really don't know, and actually I'm afraid it will not help Ukraine a lot.
Really?
Seriously. But before going to Ukraine, let's briefly talk about it. You know, there are very good books. Unfortunately, I was not prepared. I could even show you one, but it would take too much time to look for it into my shelves. But historically speaking, relatively widespread anti-American sentiment in Germany, it could be traced back not just to the, let's say, experiences of the end of the Second World War, American zone of occupation, right, and all stuff around it. It's actually deeper. It goes to at least also 19th century, when a lot of German philosophers, journalists, kind of believed and shared a view that Germany, unlike the corrupted capitalist West, has its own way, if you wish, a more spiritual way. This so-called notion of Sonderweg, so special German way. And actually, this idea already then, so we're talking about 19th century, it somehow correlated to the fascination with Russia. In other words, what I'm trying to say here, that this historical anti-German sentiment, anti-American sentiment in Germany could be analyzed together with a pretty strong pro-Russian sentiment in Germany. It was
Yeah.
strong, it is strong, and it will be strong for the next decades, if I may suggest so. And now, coming back to Ukraine, let's put it this way. This anti-American feeling, okay, as you could imagine, and easily imagine, of course, the politics of the Trump administration somehow strengthened this attitude. And you could see it in German media, in talking to people. But again, believe me, it is not about Trump or I don't know, any other American president. It's deeper. It's deeper, and actually, if you look back at, for instance, how German society, how German media reacted to Ukrainian, not just revolution of dignity, but even the Orange Revolution. So in now one could say, literally decades ago, so 2004, in this reaction, you had a pretty strong, this taste of lack of acceptance for a political movement which is supposedly being pro-American, financed by the US, and so on. I could tell you, I remember many years ago, I was giving a talk to a group of German teachers of history, and one of them, not all of them, but one of them started to reproduce this most terrible Russian propaganda narrative, saying that, but everything on the Maidan was paid by, Victoria Nuland and name it, this is the worst stuff. And I should tell you, I completely, it's kind of failed, but it was not maybe my fail, it was the fail of the narrative. So you could not destroy such a narrative by just using some rational arguments, because some people, they really tend to believe in things like that. It's kind of this conspiracy theories thinking and so on. And I think that in Ukraine, when Ukraine is planning politically, culturally, something with Germany, And if Ukraine hopes, and I think it's reasonable, of course, to hope for a potential strategic cooperation with Germany, it's important to be aware of some, let's say, specifics of German cultural history and cultural nowadays situation. And this situation, as I said, among other things, there are also other like parts of it. For instance, like another very important aspect, often ignored in Ukrainian debates, is this pretty strong post-Second World War pacifism, right? Anti-war movement and stuff like that. But at the same time, again, it's anti-American sentiment, it's pro-Russian stereotypes and feelings. And let's be frank, it's not easy for Ukraine to explain its narrative or its perspective to, let's say, every part of the German society. Of course, there are groups that understand what's going on, absolutely, and they're trying their best to help Ukraine. But let's not overlook the presence of the other groups, also politically speaking. Groups like AfD, so Alternative für Deutschland, so Alternative for Germany. And not just them, there are also, like, believe me, there are also, let's say, groups of interests inside the mainstream political parties, and explaining to them, I can say, the reason of Ukrainian, for instance, European integration, not to mention the NATO integration, is not easy at all. So that's a big challenge indeed for Ukrainian diplomacy, for Ukrainian cultural diplomacy.
Yeah,
but challenges are not bad.
Yes, yes, but now has Germany awarened its sense of responsibility for the pro-Russian policy that had been presented before the full-scale war? I mean, Nord Stream and so on. Have there been any statements about that? Yes, we were mistaken. Okay.
Now, as you know, I am from Dnipro.
Yeah.
And in Dnipro, a lot of friends of mine, they used to answer any question in a way yes and no. So that's a good, let's say, situation, a good moment.
Yes or but.
Right, to use. So let me use this Dnipro notion. Yes and no. So on the one hand, yes, because there were books published about the mistakes done. There were journalists who made special researches. For instance, how this entire story with the Nord Stream, how it developed. But at the same time, let's be frank, no, because Germany still has a president. So the president is the same guy, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, right, who was very much involved in the entire story. Now we have a lot of evidence about it. And of course, at the moment, he is, maybe I shouldn't say pretending, like he's saying that he supports Ukraine. But, you know, words are words. You should always look on like what people did and what were the consequences and what are they doing now. I would say that he himself and German politicians and the entire party he represents, so Social Democratic Party, they could have done more. Absolutely more. Why are they not doing more? I mean, to support Ukraine, to help Ukraine unconditionally, for a very simple reason. Because they, as every party in a democratic society, they rely on the expectations and views of the people who vote for them, their voters. And believe me, the voters of the SPD are not always, sometimes yes, but not always. They are not, again, like as like a big group of people, like millions, yeah, of Germans. They are not like unconditionally for supporting Ukraine, especially when it comes to issues like NATO, you know, and so on. And of course, the same goes not just to, because like I mentioned, the guy who's like very high, the president of the country. You could also mention the, let's say, professors at the universities. And actually, believe me, there were not many cases in Germany, particularly, people who would openly, let's say, criticize their own attitudes before February 24th, 2022. And I could tell you, I remember myself, it was like even like 2 days, 3 days, 5 days before the full-scale invasion. It was rather, let's say, maybe not forbidden, but not at all welcomed in German public debate, even to use the term war. We were supposed to say conflict, you know, stuff like that. I remember how many times I was like terribly, like not criticized. It was a discrimination, if I may say so. by a German audience or colleagues just for saying there is war going on since the occupation of Crimea and the intervention into Donbass. It was not at all like, not at all the common truth. And that is why, on the one hand, of course, there are some changes throughout the 3 years, like more and more people in Germany are aware that Ukraine also has right for Ukrainian transliteration of geographic names. But at the same time, if you watch German TV, which I'm doing from time to time, you'll still easily find programs where they will spell Kyiv as Kyiv, Dnipro as Dnieper, and so on. So that is why yes and no. So it is a kind of a process that is like, like ongoing process. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes lower. But I would not say, frankly, I would not say the German society or German political elites truly, like sincerely, went through a fundamental self-critical reassessment of what has happened. I would not say that, even though some people would insist, yes, they had. No, okay, that's their opinion. My impression is different.
Yes, for example, about the British perception, I have a little quarrel with my mentor from Britain, who worked as an editor of Euronews previously, and we talk about the term invaders, according to Russians. He said, no, that is so hard, no, don't use it. I said, why? Yes, they are invaders. You invade forces or something else, I think. But that is the difference between soldiers who invaded the country and took some part, and all country which supported it. It is absolutely different perception of everyone. No, it's like a balanced. We need to do that. So I highly recommend it to do that. It's a British person. So that is like we need to talk about that. And I just wanted to ask you a question about the my next question will be about the rumors. There is the perception that all Slavic and East European history departments in the EU universities have always been soaked in the Russian spirit. And I meant that foreigners will live in history, learning history from the point of view of Big Brother. Had the situation even become worse since a lot of Russian professors had to immigrate abroad? Could you describe us the situation in German universities with that?
In German universities at the moment, quite frankly speaking, as far as I know, all the professorships, all chairs, all programs in so-called Eastern European studies, because in Germany it's usually still called Osteuropa Studien, so East European studies. That's a very old term and it's still used. Actually, it is used in order to avoid, let's say, precisely naming the countries we are talking about. Because if it's Eastern Europe, it's like a broader regional definition, which includes not just Russia and Ukraine, but also at least sometimes Belarus, Moldova, and you could make the list better. The big question is, of course, what about Poland? Because in Poland itself, Eastern Europe is a term reserved for their eastern neighbors, but in Germany, Poland is also part of Eastern Europe. Okay, so if you look at those departments, you will see that all of them at the moment are, if I may say so, in a situation which could be called a crisis. What do I mean by saying that? First of all of them, believe me, they have problems with students. So less and less people are willing to study Eastern Europe in Germany. It has partly reasons like demographic reasons, which is typical for the entire continent, right? So the demographic decline is not just a phenomenon of, let's say, Poland or Bulgaria, it's also the case of Germany or France and Great Britain. But it's also, of course, the matter of foreign students who are not so willingly choosing those topics. And that is why in Germany, it's a federal country, let's not forget about it. It's like a true example of federalism. So in Germany, I assume that different lands, so Bundesländer, they will start making difficult decisions what to do with those East European departments. Maybe some professorships will be even closed or made overpaid. And in this sense, so it's like a big issue, which is even bigger than the problem of like whether it's Russian or Ukrainian studies. It's the problem of how to convince people nowadays in Germany to be interested in doing some kind of East European studies and to apply for those bachelor or master programs. Then if you look at the programs, of course, Ukrainian studies, they are still, at least in my view, underrepresented. So usually, historically, if we see this East European history or literature at the German university, most probably it would be focused on Russia and Soviet Union. Again, Soviet Union in sense Russia, because that's again like a big issue, because Soviet Union, of course, was not just Russia. And that's how it was done for decades, and that's how it looks like now. There are some exceptions, of course, as always. There are some exceptions. There is some openness, indeed, to include more Ukrainian topics into the curriculum, into, let's say, new courses suggested. There are some German universities that are already doing or seriously planning something like double programs with Ukrainian institutions. And that's very good, of course. That's what we need indeed. But it's just like, how to say it, there are important steps, but it's just the beginning of the story. And let's wait and see. Let's wait, I would say, 5-10 years to properly, let's say, analyze or conclude how the field of East European studies in Germany will change or will not change. Maybe I should also remind that even let's say late 1980s, early 90s, there were some German scholars who did indeed a lot for introducing Ukrainian topics. One of them was, of course, Andreas Kappeler, who was the first professor in Cologne. And then he moved to Vienna. Another one, scientist and historian. There were also other people. The problem is that books that they wrote, articles, projects they made, how to say it, they never indeed became a mainstream in German society's thinking about Europe. And that's the biggest question I have every day. Believe me, like the biggest question I'm like asking myself and everyone whom I meet. I'm asking like, guys, what could we do to make Ukrainian topics really interesting, more interesting, like more exciting, so that Germans would be like excited to learn more, to read more, to understand more. Because I would say that at the moment, the biggest problem is even not the Russian propaganda, or let's say some others propaganda, because there are a lot of propagandas nowadays all around. The biggest problem is this lack of or deficit, or lack of interest. And we should try somehow like to promote it, which is not easy. But still, like we should continue trying. I believe that, because like interest, it's like in human relations. It's a very important starting point for building something more. Because again, if you, as a German, let's say, important political, cultural, or academic figure, if you believe, and there are people who really believe that deeply. So if you believe that you want and need to help Ukraine, quite often this belief is based on the logics of emergency help. Like there is someone who needs help now, like help him or her now. Very good. It's not bad at all, like emergency help. But in my view, what Ukraine really needs and what could be like a real hope for a big project of European future would be not just emergency help, but a deeper understanding of strategic importance. strategic relationship, strategic, profitable, let's say, communication between the Ukrainian and the German society. And I'm afraid we're not there yet. We are like going in this direction, but there are still a lot of, steps to be made. And I really hope that at some point, this logic of emergency will be replaced by the logic of strategic partnership. And when it happens, then the relations between two countries will really move on to the next stage.
As you, I don't wanted to talk more about Russians, but the last question about Russians, I just wanted to ask you. A few years ago, you said that Germany has a Russian complex. Why did it appear from the historical and political point of view?
Okay, so I quoted someone who is a very good historian, a very good German historian, actually a very big also friend of Ukraine, friend of mine, if I may say so, Gerhard Koenen, from Frank Title. Because I would also say that in Germany, there is something like Russia's complex. And this complex is based on a combination of fascination with the Russian culture, music, ballet, name it, cinema, and a portion of fear.
Yeah.
Of course, fear, because it's nuclear state, unpredictable people, stuff like that. And from this combination of fascination and fear comes a very, very special attitude, which is, how to put it, which is irrational, which is very much irrational. That's actually, maybe I should really stress that. So thank you for this question, because I remember myself being a student many years ago in Ukraine, then in Poland. Somehow we used to believe that in Germany, unlike Ukraine, unlike Poland, we have a society, a political sphere where everything or almost everything is based on rationalities, on pragmatic decisions. Now, after spending more than 10 years at different German universities, I would prefer to tell you that with some part of despair, if I may say so, that German politics and German society is very irrational. There's a huge dose of irrationality in it. And one of those irrationalities is this Russia's complex. Because, if it's just something like rational, you could easily understand it and get out of it, or let's say rethink it somehow. But if it's really stereotypical, if it's part of your, maybe I shouldn't use this, this Freudian terminology, kind of subconscious, or unconscious, it's not easy even to recognize the problem. And for instance, let's be frank and open about it. Attempts of Ukrainian state or some Ukrainian activists to convince Germans, at least some of them, to start, let's say maybe not boycotting, but being careful with Russian cultural projects. Yeah, from Netrepko, прости господи, and until, classical Russian literature. Those attempts, generally speaking, they failed. So the majority of the society in Germany, political elites, intellectual elites, they refused. They refused to accept the argument that this is also part of the war. That's part of the problem. That's part of, let's say, explanation why the aggression happened. So this Ukrainian argument about it was not broadly accepted. And again, of course, you could always insist, even if your argument is not accepted, that's for sure. But what I'm just trying to say that in some topics, in some aspects, particularly when it comes to Russian culture, or Russia as Russia, again, Russia not as Putin's regime, but Russia as, as the biggest country in the world, right? So if in Ukraine, we could easily see this tendency to actually let's say, combine those two notions, I mean Putin's regime and Russia itself, then in Germany, you see the opposite tendency, which is to define between Putin's regime and Russia. And I could give interesting example actually. Like notice how the books of Russian oppositional thinkers, how they are called and how they are so actually they are sold everywhere. If you go to any bookshop on I read
Yes,
it like
I
a couple of days ago.
yes, I know, and not only in Germany, everywhere,
Of
in
course,
Czech
everywhere.
Republic,
Yeah, yeah, everywhere.
and everything. Navalny book about Navalny
Oh,
everywhere.
exactly,
I
exactly.
was
Very good.
shocked, really.
I was not shocked, but what is very interesting, exactly, Navalny book. I was waiting for a train because nowadays in Germany all trains are delayed, and I go to this bookshop and there was this huge Navalny volume. I have no idea who would read it. Okay, and it's called Patriot. Believe me, I could not imagine any Ukrainian politician, not just from, like Azov or Pravy sector, but any politician, even, let's say, from, let's say, like mainstream, let's say, Zelenskyy circle, who would publish a book called Patriot, and it would be approved by leading German publishing house. You are not allowed to publish books like that if you are from Ukraine. But if you are a Russian oppositionist, then it's exactly the title. And actually another book, even better one, even though it's not as popular as Navalny, not because, of course, like the death of Navalny made him particularly important. But this another book was written by a Russian journalist who lives actually, as far as I know, I'm not following precisely, but as far as I know, she lives in Germany, and her book was called even better, if I'm better. So her book was called I Love Russia. And it was also presented as a big, like, important narrative. Now, what I'm trying to say here, I'm trying to say that for the German mainstream publicity, there is a clear division line between Putin's regime and Russia. And then, like this lady, you could love Russia and hate Putin. And that's the ideal, the most politically correct position. And then, when Ukrainian writers, philosophers, filmmakers, doesn't matter, come to Germany and says, not I hate Putin's regime, but something like I hate or I disapprove Russian culture, they look as uneducated, primitive, unsympathetic people from the past. And that's the big problem. So you have this like discursive asymmetry. And that's a challenge. I would say, in my view, that's a challenge for Ukrainian cultural diplomacy. Because
Yes, but what we need to
yeah.
do in this case? What is the new strategy for us? What we need to do?
First of all, I think that on the one hand, because again, it's not even like the same group. So on the one hand, Ukrainian state, so our embassies, yeah, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other people. On the other hand, Ukrainian civil society, which exists not just in Ukraine itself. Of course, there are so many displaced scholars, writers, museum like workers, artists, name it, in Germany, for instance, right, all over the European Union. So both the state and the civil society should probably very seriously consider this matter. And in order to consider it seriously, you need, first and foremost, to analyze what's going on, to be aware of what's going on. I could give some, again, concrete examples. I've read very interesting research done by the Ukrainian Institute, if I'm not mistaken, about the images of Ukrainian culture in textbooks in different European countries, or some sociological polls made about the attitudes to Ukraine in different countries again. So what I'm trying to say, first of all, we need to know what's going on, to really know, to really understand. For instance, it's not just the matter of bringing our knowledge to Germany, our knowledge or any other knowledge. It's about understanding how German society functions, what are the topics, what are the taboos, what are the expectations, and then trying to meet those expectations. At least that's how I see it. Because, just to, uh, let's say, just reproduce the narrative which is not working, okay, that could be a very noble task for sure. And sometimes I'm doing that myself. Let me be frank about it. But again, when it comes to the question of the efficiency, right? Because the goal is what? The goal is to change the attitude, right? To find groups, sometimes just people, sometimes groups, institutions in Germany who would be really interested in strategically supporting Ukraine and who will see Ukraine as a strategic partner, as I say, as an equal partner, also in cultural debates. Because, in my view, German society could theoretically, it's not happening, theoretically, it could learn a lot from Ukrainian society in terms of pluralism, actually, in terms of defending some rights, and so on. But in order to come to this stage, you need first to, to be accepted, so to say, to be accepted and to be properly understood. Because my point may be a wrong one again. That's the point for discussion, of course. But my point is that until now, this Ukrainian cultural rhetoric or politics, it was not always successful. And somehow Ukraine failed to properly bring the message to the recipient, which is not Ukrainians, but the German society, or the French society, or the Polish society. Actually, there are also so many problems in Ukrainian-Polish relations. Why? Because the rhetoric and the language is not the same. It could be like the same, let's say, English or Polish or German, but in terms of terminology, in terms of cultural references, it's not the same. So let's seriously think about it, indeed. And then, after this step, maybe one should also consider, like which type of texts, and actually everything is text. Movie is a text, right? Music is a text. So which type of texts should be translated first, should be promoted first, should help to bring Ukrainian closer quicker, than the other matters. Because again, every country, believe me, is kind of trying to to fight for the same stuff we're talking about. Poland is trying very much to promote its cultural policy in Germany. Romania is trying to do that. Czech Republic is trying. So we are not alone in this sense. In this sense and in this challenge, Ukraine, who in terms of territory is the biggest country in Europe. And actually, believe me, that's not an obvious fact for a lot of Germans, that even with the occupied territories, Ukraine is still bigger than Germany. Not in terms of population, but in terms of territory. And maybe, if I may say so, in terms of experiences and cultural pluralism, but it's bigger. And this biggerness, it's kind of, again, it's kind of a challenge, because there is no coincidence that people like Orban and other unfriendly EU politicians, they're actually trying to make Ukrainians scary. I mean, Ukraine as a scary, let's say, story for the European Union because of its, geographical size.
Yes, and that's why we need divide Ukraine according to logic of Orban, and some part of it get to his country.
That's actually a very dangerous logic indeed. Yeah. And I think that should be one of the priority tasks, to find a very well-sounding arguments why such ideas about dividing or whatever, why they're dangerous. Because again, believe me, now we could easily observe this trend in Germany as well. More and more journalists or experts who are pretty clever people, not idiots, not this AfD paid, so serious people, they have started saying more and more publicly that, naja, to end the war, Ukraine should give up its territories. And sometimes this notion of territories goes very far. So sometimes it's just about Crimea, and sometimes it's like, indeed, like half of it, so to say. And that's exactly the narrative, of course, that the Russian propaganda is using all the time. And that's exactly a big danger, because if we start, we, let's say, European intellectuals, so just citizens, not intellectuals, like normal citizens, if we start talking this language and using this narrative, then we automatically do what? We forget about international law, we largely forget about human rights. In case of Crimea, also about the rights of indigenous ethnic groups, not just Crimean Tatars, also Karaites, also Krimchaks. And we are using the same language as Putin do. And that's exactly what he wants. So it's like, it's amazing. Indeed, for me also, it's amazing how easily this like deeply dangerous, it's not just false, it's deeply dangerous narrative of war, how easily it enters also West European debates.
Okay, but about the notions, we have the notions about retaking Berlin again from Russians. Have the Germans afraid of the Russians may indeed retake Berlin again? Or in that case, they are not believing it.
That's like actually an interesting tendency, I would say, because on the one hand, I would say that on the one hand, in my view, and as far as I know, sociology proves it as well, the majority of the German society, they do not really believe that nowadays Russia could bring war up until Berlin. On the one hand, on the one hand. On the other hand, believe me, more and more people are considering, maybe not like 100% seriously, but still considering what will they do if the war comes closer.
Baltic
And
states and Moldova, you mean, like that?
for example, especially of course our Baltic friends, yeah. And then there are those polls that are like, maybe not surprising, but still scary, saying that very, 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 very low percentage of young German citizens would even consider defending their country if, if the war happens. Please note that the new German government in Ukraine, for some reasons, there are unrealistic expectations about it. So I don't know, maybe I should not say that as a historian, but my impression is that we should not expect too much. There are no reasons to expect too much from this government. But what's interesting, that this government finally decided not to even try to reintroduce the obligatory military service for younger Germans. So on one hand, there is this like rhetoric of some, let's say, politicians, also experts, that Germany, as well as the entire NATO and EU, should prepare itself for the war. On the other hand, like in terms of like real life, you don't really see it. And that is why I think that those people who are happily greeting Netrebko at all her concerts all around Europe, I don't believe that really like seriously treat those photos with her, with those signs like, yeah, we go to Berlin and so on. For them, it's just a joke. Actually, the same one could observe, unfortunately, again and again, 9th of May in Berlin. So Berlin allowed to all types of possible pro-Soviet, pro-Russian events to happen. In other words, again, it's coming back to cultural diplomacy. The Second World War the victory over Nazism, the liberation of Auschwitz and entire Germany, because Germans treat the defeat of the Nazi regime as a liberation of Germany, is still very much linked to certain topics and themes of Soviet/Russian propaganda. And again, that's a big challenge. That's a very big challenge indeed. And actually, I could tell you more if you wish, that this logic of the end of the Second World War, when the Red Army, as I said, its official rhetoric, liberated Germany from the Nazi regime, that's what more or less they are kind of like thinking about nowadays Russia. So you have a very bad Putin's regime, but you have a very good country and people that should be liberated.
Yeah, but why
better
they
liberated in a different way.
Sorry for interrupting, but the Germans never mentioned that the part of Germany was occupied by the USSR during after the Second World War. They tried to forget about that.
First of all, a lot of people and also a lot of leading intellectuals, they believe that this occupation and then division of Germany and of Berlin, that was a fair price to be paid for the Nazi crimes. I could tell you more. One of those politicians, political journalists I was mentioning before, he said, for me it was really shocking, but apparently it's not shocking anymore here. So this guy on television, he said, the same way as we, the Germans, agreed on giving back territories after the Second World War, meaning, first of all, of course, territories given to Poland, right? So the nowadays Western Poland, it was part of Germany before and during the war. So the same way as we, the Germans, gave our territories to stop the war to the Poles and others, in the same way nowadays Ukrainians should give their territories back to Russia to stop the war. So he made a comparison. I don't know whether it came to his mind like clearly, whether it was just a coincidence,
Ridiculous.
but he compared Nazi Germany to nowadays Ukraine. And that's the problem. So not to nowadays Russia. Actually, this comparison is not very often used. I remember how it was apparently, if not mistaken, it was Sergei Zhadan who in one of his interviews or talks, who referred to like post-war ideas of Thomas Mann. Actually, Thomas Mann is a highly problematic author, also extremely pro-Russian, and it's not an easy story at all, but like a big German writer, of course. So, Sergei said that the same way as Germans were forced to recognize their collective responsibility after the Second World War, the same way Russians should recognize their historical responsibility for the ongoing war against Ukraine. And again, believe me, this notion of collective responsibility when it comes to present-day Russia is extremely unpopular in Germany. Extremely unpopular. And if you listen carefully to people like not just the previous chancellor, but the newly elected chancellor, listen carefully, not just one quote taken out of the speech, which is typical for Ukrainian media. If you listen carefully to his talks, it's the very same narrative. So, as I already said, we have a bad regime and we have a very good country and very good people. And nobody is thinking about re-educating those people. That's interesting. So you have extremely strong anti-Western propaganda inside Russia, extremely strong, and you still have extremely strong pro-Russian sentiment in the West. That's the reality.
Yes, unfortunately, and judging by the results of the recent elections, German anti-migrant sentiment has increased significantly. What is the reason for such sentiments in society? Are they being artificially fueled or not?
So, first of all, maybe it should be said that nowadays, and actually it was kind of like shown during the elections, it was an interesting situation, observation, that almost all political parties, except for the party called the Lefts, so Die Linke, all of them. So including Sarah Wagenknecht and, really all. So they kind of agreed on a point that the previous German politics towards the migrants was false and mistaken. And nowadays it's a kind of a commonplace to blame Angela Merkel. I remember those years when Merkel decided to open the borders for the, no, let's say for everyone, so to say, yeah, from Syria, Afghanistan, and so on. So when it happened, I remember being invited to a big discussion in one of the foundations. Everybody was so happy, saying like, "Oh my God, it's unbelievable! Our German politics is so like open-minded, so oriented to human rights. Great, we are the best nation in the world." Okay, so it was very naive. It was done, like again, as we see now, like how many mistakes were done by Mrs. Merkel, and how everybody was happy about them. So in all spheres, and one of those spheres was migration. So it was a big mistake. And now it's a kind of a consensus that it was a mistake. And then, like, that's like one story. But then there comes another story that in Germany, and now I'm sending like my historical interpretation. So in Germany, since the end of the Second World War, and especially after this very famous Marshall Plan of the United States, we see an incredible economic growth. So the very first generation traumatized by the war was rewarded by an incredible economic growth. And like, who knows what would happen to post-Nazi Germany without this economic miracle? But it happened. So the condition of life became much higher. And what I'm trying to say, the German democracy that developed since 1945, it was always kind of based or supported by a really high standards of life. Also, when the communism came to an end in East Germany, and when Germany was reunified, it was again a big project of economic prosperity, bringing more prosperity to the East, but also to the West. Now, what I'm trying to say, at the moment, Germany faces a really serious, let's say, in-depth economic crisis. And it was again acknowledged by everybody. So there was like consensus that we are in economic crisis. And then if you have like this combination of two very important topics, economic crisis, so inflation, yeah, a lower level of life, a lack of jobs, and so on, and growing migration, then you could easily find political groups, especially, of course, the AfD, but not only, who would say, now we
Guilty.
know exactly. Now we know who is guilty. They are guilty. So of course, that's a very, how to say it, like one-sided, and let's say that's an explanation that is not enough. Even though I would also say, like, if somebody will ask about my personal opinion, I would also say that Germany needs reforms, but it needs reforms everywhere. My impression, it needs reforms in migration policy, but it also needs reforms in university system, in school education, in taxes, in economic politics, name it. So all of it. And the idea just to like pull out one topic, I mean the migration, to say, that's like the reason for all our troubles. So that's, of course, that's very populist. That's very populist, but still a lot of people believe that and voted as they voted. And now, let's not forget that especially AfD, so this right-wing populist party that was recently proclaimed extremist, so that this party used this anti-migrant rhetoric not just against Syrians or Afghani people or name it, they also used it against Ukrainians. So in this sense, it's not just the issue of, let's say, treating people with a like really different cultural background, religious background, yeah, treating people who are coming from societies that are defined by Islam, so on. It is also about Ukrainians. And the politics of the new government towards Ukrainians in Germany would also be influenced by these tendencies. So again, it's not just, like, let's say, about them, it's also about us. It's about us. And if it's about us, I could also add that in my view, let's say my observation, it's one of the biggest paradoxes, if you wish, in present-day German cultural debate. Because on the one hand, German constitution stresses that the human dignity is the most important thing, and that everyone could become a German citizen if he or she, let's say, corresponds to a number of criteria which are actually not very complicated. So it's mostly about knowing the language on a basic level and having a job. So being, let's say, capable to function in this society. It is not very demanding if compared to other countries in the EU or worldwide, on the one hand. On the other hand, if you listen carefully to German political rhetoric, even of the mainstream parties, you will see that quite often they speak about we the Germans, not in a sense we the German citizens. Maybe they don't realize it, but I feel it immediately. But in a sense, we the Germans, like in ethnic, let's say cultural sense, like Germans. And that's a very dangerous tendency in my view, because Germany, unlike many other countries, it is indeed a society where the percentage of people with migrant background is incredibly high. It's very high. And you could not just pretend it's like, like we have Germans and we have minorities. It should really be somehow, let's say, conceptually rethought nowadays. And that is why, for me, it is always, like interesting, like also when I'm, for instance, in Poland or in France, doesn't matter, everywhere, listening how politicians or scholars, how they're using this category of we. So who are we? Who are we? And if in case of Poland, it's a bit easier, again, a bit, just a bit. But what I mean easy, because Polish society is much more homogeneous. Even though now they have a lot of Ukrainians who came, that's for sure. But still, it's much more homogeneous. Actually, it's homogeneous because of the Second World War, because people were killed or expelled. Like it's a very like tragic story. But still, nowadays it's much more homogeneous than, for instance, the German society. German society is not homogeneous in terms of ethnic backgrounds, religious, color of skin and stuff like that. And I would say that the new elites, political elites, they need somehow to, let's say, to deal with this issue. Because again, if there will be no economic growth in the nearest future, believe me, more and more populist attitudes would appear, like not just in politics, also in everyday life. Because people, like people everywhere, also in Ukraine, they're looking for like easy, understandable explanations. So if they started really like believing that the number of migrants is the reason for our economic crisis, that's a very dangerous situation for a country where migrants, now I should be careful, but at least in Berlin the percentage is more than 30%. So it's really high. It's not 5, not 7, not 8, not 10. It's really high. And you could not just, let's say, get rid of this part of population. It's very like, it's unrealistic. You could not do that. And I think this challenge, like in my view, at least in my view, it still needs to be treated seriously by the German politics. But yes, as I said, nowadays they agreed that Merkel made a mistake. That's already something. But that does not mean that they know what really to do now to change the attitude and to solve the economic problem. To solve the economic problems of Germany without cheap Russian gas, without good economic relations with the United States, and without, let's say, certain trade agreements with China. Because German economy, unlike many others in the world, it is extremely export oriented. So it is important for the German economy that the products made here, that they are sold and bought all around the globe. In this sense, it's really, how to put it, it really depends on the global economic trends.
Okay, just back to your thesis about Huawei. Almost every interview with foreign journalists, Putin uses a platform for historical lecture that is not true, but reinforces pro-Russian narratives. Should President Zelenskyy focus on to detailing Ukrainians' history as well when he talking with foreign media, and what historical facts should he highlight?
I don't know. Uh, in my view, maybe not. Maybe not. Because again, why not? Because what Putin is doing, he's trying his best to set up the language, not just for himself, but for all of us. So he wants, possibly like everyone, or as much people as possible, to start discussing topics like historical rights for Crimea. If we start seriously discussing so-called historical rights for Crimea, we are living, voluntarily or not, we are living the realm of international law and human rights law. Because historical rights, that's not a legal term. That's, that's a manipulative category. And when I heard the same historical rights, oh my God, the same historical rights in speeches and comments of some leading US politicians nowadays, I was really shocked. I'm like, oh my God, that's exactly what Putin wants. So he wants to establish the rules of conversation for all of us. And I believe we should try our best not to go into this trap, because that's a trap. Everything Putin talks about history, of course, you're right. He likes it a lot. So in every interview, of course. So that's a trap. That's a big trap. And it's not an invitation, like for historical debate. Let's say that like he said that, and Zelensky will say that, and someone else will comment on it and say, okay, actually, like both of them are. No, it is about manipulating the language of politics nowadays. So what I believe would be good, but it's not easy, of course, would be really, really good. Not just for Zelensky, for, I would say, any democratic politician or politician who like fights for democratic values nowadays. It would be to try her best to find topics or languages that would be, yeah, like accepted, supported by the others, and would be used in like in other contexts in the world. Because for me, it's really, yeah, like it is dangerous. Let's put it this way: it's dangerous, for instance, when also in Trump's rhetorics, right? The notions like democracy, human rights, they are like somehow like going like to the margins of the main topic, and the main topic would be like good personal relations, deals, right, and stuff like that. It's very, very dangerous indeed. It's very dangerous, and apparently it indicates that the post-Second World War order is coming to an end, whether we like it or not, but it's coming to an end. And I do not, as a historian, I do not believe that you could really, let's say, fight Putin with historical arguments. Doesn't matter whether they are real or false. That's the problem. Again, that's part of this game. It's very tricky and it's very dangerous indeed. And I think like everyone, every scholar also should be aware of this danger, falling into uh, political manipulation with the topics like historical rights. Um, so it's a difficult situation, indeed. But yeah, but Ukraine has no other choice. Again, look, Ukraine doesn't matter, let's say, what could be like this again, like this like historical argument about it. Ukraine needs serious strategic support from its friends, first and foremost from the neighboring countries. And I believe it is very important to promote as much as possible good strategic relations with Poland, because that's the biggest neighboring country, also part of the EU and NATO. Also Romania, it's also big. It also has a direct, okay, it's a smaller border, but still, and also common interests, especially the security of Moldova. That's something that makes us and in this sense like very close. We know what is going on in Hungary, so maybe let's not talk about it. But then, of course, we have Germany. So this big, very big, biggest EU country, which is with a lot of problems and a lot of like problematic attitudes. So, I remember like a couple of years ago, I've tried to talk at different events, saying that let's just imagine how incredibly interesting, strategically, economically, politically, could be a true alliance between Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. Never happened so far. But I think we could still dream or, let's say, imagine it, because Ukraine, how to put it, like it's obvious, but let me say it still, Ukraine could not stand this war alone. It's not just, again, it's actually, it's not just a local conflict, of course. No. And so this issue of strategic European and also, of course, in the best case, American friendship and cooperation is absolutely crucial here. Is absolutely crucial. And Ukraine needs to look for arguments, both pragmatic and, if you wish, emotional or empathetic, to those like important countries. And if you're talking about this like emotional side, here we have art, culture, music, maybe history, who knows, and
Yes,
stuff like that.
absolutely. I agree. And I just wanted to talk last part of our conversation about your book.
Mm,
I have this one.
mhm,
Yes, it's absolutely amazing. And yes, you are co-author of this excellent book, Dnipro, a biography of the great city in the steppe. I highly recommend it, reading it to anyone interested in a modern view of the development of Ukrainian cities. And this book is written in an easy style, but at the same time, it's full of interesting details. Andriy, what
mhm.
did you discover for yourself while you were writing this book as professional historian? That's first question.
Oh, I discovered so many things.
Without
First and
spoilers.
yeah,
Some.
first and foremost, I discovered indeed how how fascinating and unknown the history of the city where I was born and raised is. Indeed, and we need to know more. It's so fascinating. And actually, I could tell you it was literally a couple of days ago. I got an, let's say, preliminary agreement of the American publisher to prepare a second enlarged English language edition of the Dnipro book.
Wow,
We'll see,
congratulations.
because again, yeah, thank you. Because again, you see, like the city of Dnipro, it's huge. Um, it's very interesting. It was a closed city. Believe me, I know that because I used to bring people from different parts of the world there to kind of summer schools or conferences, and usually people were indeed impressed, because like stereotype is like that. Okay, maybe like it's somewhere in the east, it's industrial, it's poor, it's dirty, nothing else like that. And then you go there and you see menorah, and you see a lot of like very beautiful nature also, and you could find, if you know where to look for, very interesting like spots of Ukrainian culture, Jewish culture, Polish culture, Karaite culture, German culture. Of course, you know, I lived for years like next door to the evangelic church built in the early 20th century, and so on. And in this sense, my big hope is indeed that we'll have more books about other cities, other Ukrainian cities. We desperately need a book about Kryvyi Rih.
Yeah,
A huge, again,
absolutely terra
fascinating
incognita.
place. Yeah, exactly. For instance, believe me, like if some student or colleague would ask me, okay, Andriy, what could I read about Kryvyi Rih quickly in English? There is almost nothing to recommend. And unfortunately, the same goes to Mykolaiv, the same goes to Mariupol. So seriously, like I really hope that we'll have more cities biographies like that written in Ukrainian, in English, maybe in Polish, in German, who knows. But this aspect, I mean, this urban history of Ukraine, for some reason, it is not very well developed. So there is a lot of work to be done, and I really hope that colleagues will do that. And for this book, of course, I'm very grateful that my sister, she helped me, she helped me to quickly finish it. And we are very grateful to Vihora Publishing House, who agreed to publish it. But as I said, I would be very happy if this like series of biographies of Ukrainian cities will continue and expand.
In your book, you describe in detail the Soviet times when Dnipro was a secret city. Is it interesting that practice was copied from the United States, where secret cities first emerged, where they were involved in the defense projects? How we have now we have the situation where the world is preparing for the active hostilities again. Can secret cities re-emerge in the world or in the Ukraine especially?
Uh, Probably so. Probably so. Like imagine, like again, like ask yourself where Iran is trying. Hopefully, they will not manage it to finalize their nuclear program, or where weapons, also Ukrainian weapons, are nowadays produced. I could tell you more that in case of Ukraine, not just Dnipro, or again also Mariupol or other places, we see that we see how Soviet infrastructure, Soviet industrial infrastructure, plays an enormous role in nowadays war. And again, if you look at, I don't know why I mentioned Mariupol here, it was actually part of this huge Katerinoslav gouvernement before the October Revolution. So in Mariupol as well as in Dnipro, we have industrial objects, so huge factories that historically, yeah, should be attributed even not just to a Soviet period, but to the industrialization of the late Russian Empire. Actually, mostly by Western businessmen, so people from France, Belgium, Great Britain. That's how it works. And of course, Dnipro, it was the biggest. It was the biggest closed city in Soviet Ukraine. Like imagine you have a millionaire city, and you should pretend like there is a fabric, this Pivden-Mash, so like rocket fabric, and nobody knows that it exists. Yeah, it is never shown on any map. So if you take Soviet maps, like this huge area where those rockets were built, designed and built, is just like absent. It's like there is like nowhere. No, okay, it's very like interesting, especially of course nowadays when we have those like incredible satellite pictures, right?
Yeah.
Also, like everywhere in the world. Okay, no, but you know, it was like that, and I could tell you, I remember it also as a kid that on the one hand it was closed, so it was forbidden. It was a taboo to mention it. I mean the rockets. On the other hand, of course, everybody knew, like everybody, because you know, like you could not live in this city and don't know that some of your neighbors or family members or school friends, so on, that their parents or their grandparents or again their friends that they are working exactly with the rockets and so on. So it was like everywhere. And like imagine that you have this like everyday life in Brezhnev years especially. And in this everyday life, there are no foreigners, no foreign cars, no stuff like that. But there are rockets all the time. They're like somewhere present, like all the time around you. And yeah, so I think actually that this notion of Soviet closedness could and should also be used for promoting Dnipro in terms of tourism.
But
Okay,
uh, but
nowadays,
but sorry for interrupting.
yeah,
How should the
yeah.
Soviet period of Dnipro be interpreted now? Should we refuse to glorify that period? On the other hand, at the time we observed some developments, including in the space industry, and which was rising. How should we balance between this bad communism and its impact on the scientists' development?
Uh, I believe that history writing is always about balancing, indeed, always about it. It's like nowadays, or again, like in medieval times or imperial times or the Soviet times. And actually, it was a big challenge, of course, to me and my sister Tatiana, like how, on the one hand, to show, again, as I said, this everyday life of a big industrial, prosperous, actually, city, but on the other hand, not to forget about all the repressions, about Russification, about the fate of those numerous intelligentsia people who were arrested and often also shot dead. And like in this part of the history about Brezhnev years, we are of course writing about the rockets and stuff like that. It's actually declassified. It's no secret anymore. Everybody knows what's going on. But on the other hand, we are writing about the psychiatric hospitals actually. There were several locations where dissidents were treated as mentally ill persons. That's also part of the story. Soviet Dnipropetrovsk, please. Or about Ivan Sokulsky, this prominent Ukrainian poet who was arrested and then sent many times to the Soviet camps. For what? For writing his Ukrainian poetry and for criticizing Brezhnev's nationality politics. So that's how history works. And then, like after decades, in the history of the city, or nowadays also in the city landscape, so the street names, right? We have on the one hand streets named after the directors of those rocket factories, of course, and on the other hand streets named after Ivan Sokulsky. And again, believe me, like if you like look back in the late 70s, for instance, there was no chance for them to meet. So people like Sokulsky and, for instance, Makarov, they lived like in a completely different context, but in history they both belong to to the past, of Dnipro, of Ukraine, of Europe. Because again, this story is not just Ukrainian; it's also a European story, and it's the same also nowadays. Believe me. So, in this sense, being a historian is always about looking for those balances and being prepared sometimes to tell or to describe unpleasant things, yeah, but being always aware that the main task for you as an author is not to forget about the context. In our case, of course, the context of Soviet totalitarian regime, Brezhnev regime, and not to forget that we nowadays we are looking at the history back, at the past back, from the perspectives of our days. But people whom are we talking about, they have no idea of the future. Like they lived in this place, like my parents did, and many, many millions of people. And for them, it was unclear what will happen next. That's the difference. So for Sokulsky, it was unclear that the Soviet Union will collapse in 1991, but we know that already. We know that. We know, for instance, nowadays, we know that Vasil Stus, yeah, was killed in the camps just like less than 6 years before the collapse of the entire system. But that's the knowledge we have nowadays. So historians should be always aware that the knowledge you have was impossible for your heroes from the past. And if you don't forget about it, then I believe you could write an interesting and, let's say, inspiring history.